course, everyone would turn around to me and all the other Japanese American students and say, you know, this was the day that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And so it's a very uncomfortable day for me. And I remember freshman year that, and this was in 1967, that you know, the day came, you know, I was taking, you know, biology, chemistry, and classes like that. There was absolutely no reference to that particular event. And went to dinner. It was fine. And then at 9 o'clock exactly, everybody in my dorm room came to my room and threw water balloons at me and started to chant, "Bomb Pearl Harbor, bomb Pearl Harbor, bomb Pearl Harbor." And, you know, I wasn't quite prepared. I didn't know whether I should be laughing like everybody else or crying or whatever. And as I'm dripping wet, you know, a student who had been the National High School Debate Champ the previous year comes up to me and recites by memory President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Declaration of War speech. And so, you know, everybody has a good laugh and they leave. And I remember sort of wondering, you know, that night and in the days after, you know, why it was that, you know, a third-generation Japanese American, you know, some 25 years after Pearl Harbor, would still be reminded of all of this and still be associated with a war between the United States and Japan. And I remember that, you know, even though I was taking, you know, all these science classes and so forth, that it was about a week later that I went to the library to check out the very, very first book that I would consider an Asian American Studies book. And it was written by three UC Berkeley law professors, Tenbrook, Barnhart, and Mason, called Prejudice, War, and the Constitution. And this is a book about the history and the constitutionality of the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans. And, you know, growing up, even though I knew sort of, you know, that my parents had had this experience, along with my older brother, who's going to have the operation tomorrow, I actually knew hardly anything about the event. I knew more about Pearl Harbor than I did about, you know, the sort of aftermath, and particularly the aftermath to my family. And so this was the very first book. So I always tell the story about, you know, if I trace my roots in Asian American Studies to one particular event or book, it would be that. And that was the very first book that I read in Asian American Studies. And my freshman year was quite, filled with controversy. During the second semester was when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and later at the end of the semester was when Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And I had a very, very interesting experience afterwards in the summer. I was a VISTA volunteer, VISTA being somewhat like a domestic Peace Corps program in a small little town in Oklahoma called Idabel. It's a small town of 5,000 people, and because I said I wanted to be a pre-med, they wanted me to set up this emergency medical program. And I remember the other thing they wanted us to do was to kind of see sort of inter-ethnic relations and how well the different groups there could get along. And the following, at the end of the summer, Booker T. Washington High School would no longer exist, and all of the students from the poor side of town would go into Idabel High School. So they wanted to know how the the Choctaw Indians who were there, the African Americans, and so forth might get along. And being outside trying to set up this emergency food and medical program, my skin got fairly tan. And so I remember that the whites didn't particularly like me because they thought I was a Choctaw Indian. And the African Americans didn't quite trust me initially because they thought I was a Choctaw Indian. And the Choctaw Indians didn't like me because they knew I wasn't a Choctaw. And returning back to Yale, I took a class that had it's sort of like a model UN class, and we represented different countries, and I happened to represent Mexico. Why? And one of my, who had become one of my very, very long-time friends, a guy named Joaquin Avila, who eventually becomes a big voting rights specialist for Moldova and civil rights and so forth. Of course, he represented the United States, and he tried to, buy me off, tractors and other kinds of things. And Joaquin one time said, asked me, we talk a lot and so forth. I'm going to go and picket and give out information booklets about the Great Boycott at some of the local supermarkets. Would you like to come around? Come with us. And so I went with, the 6 or 7 other Chicanos at Yale at the time. Another being who also became a very, very long-time friend, Justice Carlos Moreno of the California Supreme Court. So it was really my sophomore year that the group of Mexican Americans at Yale decided to form an organization. And we were very much taking our agenda of trying to seek greater admissions, to set up the first Chicano Studies class, to have a student conference, all these things from what we thought or what we saw among African American students at Yale. And so it was at the end of my sophomore year in the summer that I got a call from Alan Kumamoto. And Alan said, I have this guy here in my office who's going to start Yale in the fall. He's going to be a graduate student in social psychology. And would you come over and sort of answer some questions, and kind of tell him how things are at Yale. And that's when I met Glenn Omatsu for the very first time. And, Glenn asked me, at our meeting, he said, what are some things that you do? And if you've ever had Glenn as a student, I may be a person of few words, but Glenn can be a person of few words too, and can really be asking a very, very tricky question there. And I remember telling Glenn that, I was involved with, this Chicano student organization called MECHA, and we're, doing all these things with admissions. We're trying to set up the first class. We have conference and all this stuff. And then Glenn asked this question. He said, are the Asian Americans organized at Yale? And I remember thinking a little bit about that question, and I remember my response, and I said, well, that's an interesting idea.